welcome to Chocks Hangar. That was Pink Floyd with Arnold Layne.
Now, if you're wondering why I picked Pink Floyd Arnold Layne, those of you that are familiar with the band will know that that record came out in '67 to promote their forthcoming album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And there are two new Pipers out for Microsoft Flight Simulator, one from Just Flight, one from Carenado, both PA-28s. So I figured we'd have a bit of a showdown between them. So let's go. Okay, first shot in this particular showdown goes to Carenado because they released their PA-28 first. When we've looked at this one, then we'll look at the Just Flight. So here we are looking at it. It's one of several paint jobs that you get. You'll notice that you can put your own registration number on there if you want to, as you can on the Just Flight one. Broadly, the Carenado and the Just Flight PA-28s are essentially the same aircraft. However, there is a very obvious visual difference between the two when you look at them, and it's this. The Carenado one is modelled with a Macaulay two-bladed prop. The Just Flight one, as we'll see, has something different when we get to it. Three-bladed prop. If you're not sure about what the differences are between the two-bladed prop and a three-bladed prop, a two-bladed prop is a little bit more efficient and will usually give you a slightly faster cruise speed than a three-bladed prop, but they're noisier than a three-bladed prop. A two-bladed prop tends to be a little bit noisier in terms of noise and sound levels, and that is why some people go for three-bladed props, because they're quieter at airports. There are some airports where they prefer you to have a quieter propeller noise. The other difference, which doesn't really make a lot in the sim, difference in the sim, is that two-bladed props are not as expensive as three-bladed props. If you're curious about how much that sort of thing costs, the propeller that you see on this thing would probably be $8,000 or $9,000, something like that. The three-bladed prop that we see on the, or we will see on the Just Flight PA-28, those are usually about 12 grand maybe. So a three-bladed prop is more expensive. So there is a visual difference on these things, and it's the propeller. The other visual difference that you see between the two is the antennas that are on it for the various bits of avionics that are in there. So they do look a little bit different. But as you can see, that this is a typical Carenado flight sim add-on. It's a very, very accurate model. It's very nicely textured. There's a lot of good detail on the thing. So no complaints about how it looks. And that level of detail and the nice treatment of the texturing and stuff like that continues on the interior of the thing, so we'll have a look at that. So here we are inside the thing. Now, if I zoom in on this, you can see that these textures do stand very, very close inspection, and the instruments and all that kind of stuff do stand up well to however much you want to zoom in. So if you like pretty cockpits, then this thing is very, very pretty. And unlike the Just Flight one, which has two options on it, one for a shiny, pristine cockpit and one for a bit of a worn looking cockpit, this thing only comes with a kind of pristine cockpit. It's not absolutely perfect. There are, if you look on the window there, you can see that there's a bit of sort of dirt or scratches or what have you on the windscreen, but generally speaking, this is modelled as though it's a very shiny, new and well looked after PA-28. The vast majority of stuff in here functions. Not all of it does. There are one or two things that don't function. For example, the circuit breakers don't function, and if I move the view over ever so slightly, this thing here, which is the emergency system to lower the landing gear if you have problems with the normal system, doesn't function on this, and it does on the Just Flight one, as we'll see when we get to looking at that. But other than a couple of things like that, the vast majority of stuff in here is clickable. Now, in common with most Carenado aeroplanes, before I forget, checklists on here. Bit difficult to read because the visor flips a little bit too far forward, but there are checklists on there, so that thing works as well. And whilst we're looking up on the roof, whilst we're looking up on the roof, this light functions, and you can change the brightness of it and dim it down if you want to. So, in common with a lot of Carenado add-ons, when you click on the yoke, you get this thing, a little sort of iPad attached to the steering yoke, and it's got a lot of functions on it. Now, there is a bit of a gotcha on it, which is, and it actually tells you, it says, these items only work if the plane is stopped on the ground, all systems and engines off, and the parking brake is set. That can catch you out. You might be sort of like furiously clicking on these things, and if you haven't got the parking brake on, it's not going to do anything. So you can see I've just taken the parking brake off there, and oops, it's not working. But if I put the parking brake back on, they do work. Now, if we take a look at them externally, put the pilot on like that, and then what we'll do is we'll open the co-pilot door there, and we'll open the baggage door as well. So if we have a look outside, you can see what we've got: some cones, some remove before flight tags, some chocks, a tow bar attached to the front, covers over the engine intakes. We come around the other side. You've got a ground power unit plugged in. You've got the cargo door open, not much in there, and then you've got the main door open. If we go back inside, the one thing that you can't do with this is you can't sort of latch the door partially open, which you can do on a real PA-28, and anyone who's flown one in this kind of weather, we're in the United States here at the minute, will know that this thing can get warm inside, so the ability to kind of latch the door open a little bit is kind of useful on a PA-28, but of course it doesn't really matter much in the sim. So anyway, we'll turn those external elements off, and we'll close the co-pilot door, and we'll close the baggage door, and we'll have a look outside, just make sure that has shut. So now everything's off. Now then, other things that are on this system here, on the next page there, you've got startup options. The click spots are a little bit funky on these. You have to kind of mess around with them a little bit, but if you hit cold and dark cockpit, then you have to hit done. So you've got three options on there: cold and dark if you want to start everything you saw, ready for taxi, and ready for takeoff. So pretty obvious what those all do. You've got a takeoff checklist, and you've got a landing checklist, and that's your lot. So it doesn't really matter that you can't read those checklists on there very well, because you've got them on your little iPad on the control column. The other thing that the control column can do is you can hide it or you can show it. You can do the same thing on the other one over on the other side. So vast majority of stuff in here works. So let's get this thing cranked up. I'll give you a look behind so you can see the texturing on the thing, and you can see that it is typical Carenado stuff. Very high resolution and looks really nice. So let's get this thing cranked up. So, prop fully forward, mixture on. We'll select a fuel tank. Since we are going to be flying it, I'll play around with the trim a little bit. On there. Let's go for a little bit of nose up trim. Bit difficult to see the trim indicator because of where the seat is positioned, but it's definitely there. I was using my hardware to trim that. If you were wondering how I was moving it, you can click on it with it if you want to and move it that way. So let's see what we've got. We want the battery on, and we want the most of these switches function, although you'll notice not all of them do. We want the alternator on, and we're going to want the fuel pump on, and we've definitely got fuel in, and we've definitely selected a fuel tank. So what we should be able to do is we should be able to start the thing. Now, just make sure the parking brakes are on. So here we go. And there we go. You can hear what this thing sounds like. Now, I'll go on the external view so you can hear it externally. So it sounds pretty good. Although I suspect that a two-bladed prop would be making a bit more noise than that. But of course what you can do is you can go in your sim and you can tweak the settings if you want to. Now, back on the inside. Just so it doesn't look weird. Let's come on this. we'll we'll have a pilot showing. Look on the external view. Yeah, now we've not got a ghost flying the thing. Now, obviously, all these instruments do pretty much what you'd expect them to do. So the altimeter, I'm just going to check it. Yeah, it's reading 3,000, so we're all right. You know what I mean? For when we do a circuit, we can leave it on that. Now, of course, what I should really have done, if I was flying this for real, is I should have got some lights on and what have you, and shouted clear prop and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, since we're in the sim, I'm not going to worry about it too much. So anyway, what I'm not going to worry about either is I'm going to get all of these things on Pitot, apart from the autopilot master. This is the switch that doesn't function, the day-night thing there, or at least as far as I'm aware it doesn't function. Don't kill me if I'm incorrect about that. So the little avionics radio master switch on there turns everything on. Is it all on here? I don't know, maybe you have to manually put this on. I think you might have to manually put the transponders on as well if you haven't started it previously. So this is a difference between the Carenado one and the Just Flight one. What you see is what you get on this Carenado one. There's no options to swap out different avionics and stuff like that. There is a bit of that going on the Just Flight one, as we'll see when we have a look at it. On the plus side, however, this has got a slightly more modern avionics suite with a funkier autopilot, which would let you fly automatic approaches and stuff like that. The avionics set in the Just Flight one is modelling a slightly older avionics setup, but you can tweak it a little bit, as we'll see. So mix is fully rich, props fully forward. Blah 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 blah. That's all okay. So we'll take it for a bit of a fly so you can see it in the air. Now, there is one thing that I must point out. This Carenado plane came out about a week and a half ago, and as I'm recording this, there was a patch for Microsoft Flight Simulator that came out a couple of days ago, and Just Flight waited until the patch was released before they released their PA-28, which was yesterday at the time that I'm recording this. And what that patch has done is it's broken a bit of the functionality on this Carenado PA-28. Not in a terrible way, I can still show you it. But what it's done is it's made the flaps pitch this thing down really badly, to the point that you'd be very, very hard pressed to taxi it, because it tries to do a somersault on the runway because it's pitching down so much with the flaps. And it means that if you put the flaps down when you're in the air, it goes into a screaming nosedive. So when I fly this, I'm going to have to take it off with no flaps, and when I bring it in for a landing, I'm going to have to bring it in with no flaps as well, which will be interesting. We'll see how well we get on with that. It is not the fault of Carenado, it's the patch that's done that, but it's the price they paid for getting it out before that patch, whereas Just Flight waited. So when we see the Just Flight one in a little while, we'll see that we've got no problems with the flaps on that thing. Anyway, with that little caveat explained, let's taxi this thing out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on the external view for that, so we can get a nice view. And we've not got very far to go to the runway, it's just there. So let's rev this thing up so you can hear what it sounds like. So quite a nice engine noise. Just give you a bit of a listen to that. Then we'll cut the throttle back a little bit, and then we'll release the parking brakes. And straight onto the runway. Now keep in mind, I haven't forgotten the flaps. I'm just not putting them down because this thing would start pitching nose down if I put the flaps on. I am sure that Carenado will fix it, and as I say, it's not really their fault. It's one of the disadvantages of Microsoft Flight Simulator. Every time they patch it or tweak it or what have you, it breaks a lot of things. They normally get around to fixing it pretty quick, but it's just something to be aware of. Incidentally, all these avionics are still functioning pretty well, so don't worry about it. I wouldn't let that little flap issue put you off buying this Carenado one if you like the look of it, because you can still fly it, and that will be fixed pretty quickly. So anyway, let's get this thing in the air. Now, so I'm going to go full throttle on this thing. I'm going to let it wind up. Now, what I will do is I'll roll the view back a little bit so that you can see the rudder pedals, and you can see that I'm not having to give it much rudder here to keep this thing straight on the runway. In fact, I'm not touching the rudder at all. Now I am. That's not particularly realistic. You would have to give it at least some rudder to keep this thing tracking straight on the runway, and especially getting up to the speed I'm up to now, because I'm going to have to get this thing going really fast before I lift it off, because we've got no flaps. We should be able to get in the air now. So up we go, and because the speed's building, I'm going to get the gear up. Now then, let's give it a bit of trim. I've got to be really careful not to hit the flaps control on my external hardware, because if I hit the flaps, this thing's just going to pitch straight into the ground. So we'll get the throttle back a little bit, and then we'll make a turn, because obviously we want to go for a circuit. I'm not going to worry too much about, you know, maintaining circuit height and stuff like that, because we're really only showing the thing off a little bit. I have noticed with this thing that the patch that came out for Microsoft Flight Simulator the other day, it does seem to be making the sim a little bit jerky in places. And of the two PA-28s, the Carenado one and the Just Flight one, the Just Flight one I think runs ever so slightly smoother. There's not much in it, but I think this Carenado one is suffering for ever so slightly more stutter than the Just Flight one. So I think of the two, this is the one that's probably a little bit more resource hungry. Like I say, there's not much in it, but there is a bit of a difference noticeable. Now, as far as how this thing flies, I wouldn't say that it's exactly like a real PA-28. I think it's a bit not exactly how a PA-28 moves. The PA-28s are, I wouldn't say they're sluggish, but you know, they were designed to be, you know, easy and safe to fly and what have you, so they're a bit ponderous sometimes on the controls. And this thing, it's not a million miles off, but it's not exactly like a PA-28. It's not far off, and I'd say it's a bit more like a kind of generic GA plane, so it's still kind of fun. And like I say, it's not a million miles off, but you know, if you're looking for sort of A2A levels of realism and stuff like that, as is usually the case with Carenado, you know, you might be a little bit disappointed, but let's have a look, see where we are in relation to that. A bit on the low side, so let's get some power on. Let's pitch it up a little bit, but you can see from this that I'm using my hardware trim wheel. It's pretty easy to trim out and what have you. Notice, however, that I'm not having to give it any rudder or anything like that. I'm literally not touching the controls at all. There I am clapping my hands just to prove that I'm not touching the controls. And no, I'm not using my rudder pedals at the moment. I've got my rudder on my HOTAS throttle at the minute. So yeah, I'm not touching any controls, and this thing's staying reasonably straight and pretty stable. So you know, there you go. Anyway, a little bit of a look on the external view. What I was saying about, you know, like it, you know, maybe it being a little bit more frame rate hungry than the Just Flight one. It's not exactly struggling. I just noticed a slight difference between the two, so don't worry about it. I'm not suggesting that it's a frame rate hog or anything like that. Oh, one thing that I have noticed that's better on this than it is on the Just Flight one is this. Can you see I've got the light on the nose? Have a look and make a mental note of what that light looks like on the front of that, and then we'll have a look at what it looks like on the Just Flight one. It's better than it is on the Just Flight one. the texturing on the light is better on this thing. It's just something I did notice. Anyway, let's bring this thing round. Now keep in mind that I am not going to be able to put the flaps down on this thing, because if I do, it'll just go into a screaming death dive. So let's bring this thing round. If you watch the end of the video, if you make it all the way to the end of the video, there's a little bit of a treat that's a Mickey take of a spaghetti western with these two planes, and it's at the desert boneyard, where there's all the planes parked up in the desert. This airfield, there you go, that's they're closing the throttle too much. This airfield is not too far from there, so if you're wondering where I am, I'm out in the desert in the US. Now then, you can see there that we're doing 80 knots, and I'm gonna need to get the throttle all the way back. I daren't put the flaps down, but I can put the gear down to try and lose a little bit of speed. Now ordinarily with the gear down and the throttle all the way back, this thing would be losing quite a bit of speed with the throttle all the way back, and it doesn't. Yeah, this is a noticeable difference in the way the thing flies. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to start side slipping the hell out of this thing to try and get it down, because otherwise we're going to be way too high. And you might be able to tell from the engine note there that even with the throttle all the way back, it's not really slowing down. And I'm going to have to get really low here to try and bleed some speed off, because otherwise I'm never going to get this thing down. Now I've had the throttle all the way back all that time, and we're barely losing any speed. Now granted, I've not got any flaps down, but this thing does not bleed speed like you would in the real thing. I mean, I would, with the throttle off there, I'd never make it over those rocks. You can see this thing's holding speed like crazy. And even now we're still holding a lot of speed, to the point where I was suspecting that I might run out of runway there. So although, you know, I admit that, you know, it's not particularly realistic, but it is nice to fly and it's fun to fly. And as I say, I didn't have any flaps on, which would have added to the drag and enabled me to land the thing a little bit better. But you saw there, if you watch on that video, if you were looking at the throttle quadrant, I had that throttle all the way back, and that thing wasn't losing speed as it came in. So, you know, it made for a bit of a fun challenge, but it wasn't particularly realistic. I'm going to go to the external view there. I do like the engine sounds on it. They're nice. Although I think, like I say, I think that two-bladed prop would probably be a bit noisier. And I'm after giving it a lot of throttle to get it moving. So that's kind of ironic that, you know, the thing would barely lose any speed when I was bringing it in, when I had the gear down, and then when I get it on the ground I have to give it loads of throttle just to get the thing to speed up. So that is the Carenado PA-28 Arrow 3. It's 20 quid. It's nice. If you like a simple GA plane that looks good, has modern avionics, and you only want to pay 20 quid, would I recommend it? Yes, even in spite of the fact that the flaps are a bit busted at the minute on the thing. That's a function of the sim. and I'm sure that Carenado will get around to patching it, or Microsoft Flight Simulator itself will be patched, so that won't be a problem. So don't let it put you off. Anyway, let's have a look at the Just Flight alternative. So here we are back at La Chola Air Park in Tucson, Arizona, where we were before looking at the Carenado PA-28 Arrow, and now we're looking at the Just Flight PA-28 Arrow. So, as mentioned on the Carenado part of the video, there's a difference between the Just Flight 1 and the Carenado 1. Carenado 1 has a two-bladed Macaulay prop, and the Just Flight 1 has a Hartzell three-bladed prop. Three-bladed props usually give you a slightly better climb rate, a slightly worse top cruise speed. They're quieter, there's a bit less vibration from them, but they're a little bit less sort of efficient and what have you. So, you know, it's a difference. Anyway, if we come off that view and we have a look at this thing externally, you can see that again, this thing is a very nice model. It will also let you put your own registration number on there if you want to, although you have to select a specific paint job for it to allow you to do that. There, if you have a look at that, you'll notice what I was talking about before, the nose light on this. I think that's slightly better on the Carenado one. However, it sort of swings and roundabouts with the texturing on these things, because you'll notice that this thing is absolutely filthy underneath. And if anyone knows PA-28s, they'll know that one thing that happens with PA-28s is they do get very dirty underneath, because they're quite low slung, and the exhaust tends to sort of spit out a lot of dirt down the underneath of the fuselage. So there are plus points on the texturing of this thing and plus points on the texturing of the Carenado one. I personally prefer the modelling on this thing. I think, you know, stuff when like the sort of serrations, the corrugations on the wing and stuff like that are a bit better defined on that. When we look on the tail, that's a little bit better defined. I also like the larger anti-collision light on the tail of this thing. I think it looks a bit more like it. And then when you look at things like the shading around where the antennas are and stuff like that, I think it just looks a little bit nicer. It's not very often someone can give Carenado a run for the money on visuals, but I think this thing does. We can see on this thing, I've got all the external stuff on at the moment. So I've got tie downs on there. There's chocks in place. There's a tow bar on the thing. When we come round there, you can see that we've got a cargo door open, and we've got the main sort of like cabin entry door open. Now, if I go back on the inside, like on the Carenado one, there is like a little iPad where you can mess around with stuff. There are some differences on this. There's a bit more clickable stuff in this, and there's a bit more customizable stuff. Notably, things like this. Boom. You can click on stuff on the doors and what have you, and you can play around with those latches. So what that will actually let you do is it will let you sort of pseudo latch the door a bit. Did you see that? The door opened a little bit. So you can do that kind of see there? You can do that kind of thing like you do in real life. Not that it makes a lot of difference in the sim, but it's just one of those little touches, you know, a bit more clickable stuff. And the other thing that I was talking about when I was looking at the Carenado one was that thing there on the floor, with the sort of emergency gear thing. It's functioning on this thing, as are most things. Another thing that's functioning on this thing, which isn't functioning on the Carenado one, is you'll notice you can pop the circuit breakers. So if you like your realism, then this thing is a little bit more clickable. It's up to you whether you like the texturing on the thing, but again, it does stand up to quite close inspection. Keep in mind that this thing is modelled as though it's a bit shabby and stuff like that, but you do have the option to be able to change between a sort of shabby, well-worn cockpit and a nicer one. Now, like the Carenado one, it's got ready for takeoff, where it's going to give us the engine running. It's got ready for start, where I'll let you do that, and it's got cold and dark. So, same stuff as the Carenado one. It has got this maintenance stuff where you can refill the oil and recharge the battery and stuff like that, and it does simulate a bit of wear and tear as well, as MSFS does now itself. You've probably seen that on the way you select your plane menus. They can simulate a bit of wear and tear now. But if you like sort of being a little bit more careful with things, like you don't want to get hydraulic locks and things like that and what have you, then this thing does a little bit of that as well. It's not quite up to sort of A2A levels of obsession with that kind of thing, but it does do a bit more than the Carenado one. So auto fuel selector, let's get rid of the chocks. Let's get rid of the tie downs. We've got rid of the tow bar, cabin door, baggage door, and oil door. Oh, the oil door, like that, for when you're messing around with it. So there you go. If you like simulating doing that sort of thing, you can. And you've got things like refill the oil and recharge the battery and stuff like that. So if your battery's conked out and what have you, you can simulate all that malarkey if you like. Now, avionics wise, you've got this thing here, or you can swap it out for that thing there. So if you want to go a bit more old school with a GPS that's just kind of a line of text, or you want to go a bit more modern like that, then you can do that kind of thing. So there are, lots of different avionics options on this thing, which is kind of cool, really, that you can do that, because they'll let you play about with it a little bit. There aren't too many add-ons that will let you do that. Lots of them will let you do it by sort of going into the config file and typing stuff in, but there aren't many that will actually let you do it on the fly. It's a really nice feature, that. Like on the Carenado one, you can play around with those sun visors, but unlike on the Carenado one, you can tilt these to different angles. However, they don't have the checklist on them like the ones on the Carenado do. Like the Carenado one, this thing has a floodlight. However, have a look at some of this texturing on the roof. It's a bit low res. People have been a little bit critical of this, and to be fair, I think they've got a point. Yeah, it's not as good as it could be in some places. I mean, that where it says engage latch before fly is meant to be just a printed sticker that someone's put on there, so you can get away with that being a bit low res. But when you look at that thing, the labeling on this thing here, that is fairly low res in comparison to what you've got on the Carenado one. And when you look at this stuff here, some of it's not quite as sharp as it is on the Carenado one. So if I was being picky about which one's got the sharpest textures in the cockpit, I would say that the Carenado one. I don't mind this. I think it looks okay. But if you're being strictly honest, you've got to give marks to Carenado for that, in terms of the textures. Now, one thing that you can do, however, with the textures is you'll probably notice that the windows are modelled with a lot of dirt on them and scratches and stuff like that. There is an option to change that configuration so that you can have cleaner windows if you want. It's not a clickable, switchable option. I think you have to edit a config file to do it. They might end up patching that and making it a clicky thing on this iPad. But at the moment, you actually have to go into the config file. But if you want clean windows, you can have them. But in terms of texturing, I think it's pretty close between the two. But I have to give the sort of sharpness score to the Carenado one, because it does edge it a little bit. In terms of clickability and what have you, though, this cockpit is sort of more realistic. Anyway, let's get this thing started. Unlike the Carenado one, because this came out after the patch that came out the other day, this thing doesn't have any problem, and I will actually be able to fly it with the flaps if I need to. So if we want to start this thing up, obviously we need to get that on. We need to get the fuel pump on. Just for fun, we'll put the lights on and stuff like that. These things are your instrument lights and your sort of panel lights and what have you. These are sort of rollable switches and what have you. So if we start turning those things on, you can see that you can light up the instruments and what have you. The other one is, if you look on the avionics, where the squawk code is and where it says ident, you can see that that's lighting that one up. So if you like playing around with that, and this thing up here, this light in the ceiling up there, will give you a red light that you can dim and what have you. So at night, this thing's better to fly than the Carenado. It's got more customizable lights and what have you that you can play around with and what have you. Now, fuel tank selector is on cutoff, so we'll select a tank for it, and we need the mixture fully forward. There's a gotcha on this. There's like on the real thing, there's a bit of a lock that you can engage to there. You can see there, mixture lock. You can put that on or off and what have you. So if you find that you can't use the mixture control and what have you, just be aware that you've got that. So there's little touches throughout this plane that make it a little bit more realistic than the Carenado one. How obsessed you will be with that sort of thing is entirely up to you. Anyway, let's get this thing started. You can hide the yokes and show the yokes on this thing, and unlike with the Carenado one where the little iPad thing appears on the yoke, you can, if you want to, hide that one as well, and get that going on there. Now, keep in mind that you need to get this thing started fairly quickly. So if you get problems with that, you might find that you have to, recharge the battery or what have you to get the thing working on there. That was me sort of talking for a long time. So let's get this thing started. So and there it goes. Now, so as I was saying, you can hide the iPad with that little clicky switch there. Now, what that means is that in contrast to the Carenado one, you can have the iPad up on screen, and you can still have things like the little timer on your yoke showing and what have you, whereas the iPad on the Carenado one appears over the yoke and it hasn't got one of them timers on it anyway. So if you like using your chronograph to sort of navigate, which I do, to be honest, I think it's not useful to have a chronograph. Then that's another thing that I would say was a little bit of an advantage to things. We can cheerfully put the flaps down on this thing without breaking anything. If we look on the external view, we've got the lights flashing on this thing. I think the lights are a little bit brighter on this thing than they are on the Carenado one. So I prefer the wingtip lights on this, and I prefer the strobe lights. However, I much prefer the light on the nose of the Carenado one to this. So they're kind of scoring points against one another in various little bits and pieces. So it's not, it's tempting to sort of say that this thing is, it's better and what have you. Not in every respect it isn't. And besides which, this is 10 quid more than the Carenado one. It's 30 quid or 29.99 or whatever the hell it is. If you've had any Just Flight arrows for like Flight Sim World or P3D or what have you, you qualify for a discount. It's on you when you look on your account at Just Flight. It's on there and what have you. It takes it down to 20 quid-ish, and you can throw some loyalty points at it as well and what have you. So I ended up getting this thing for a little over 20 quid. So I paid more or less the same as I would have done for the Carenado one. It makes it a bit of a bonus. There's another thing to bear in mind with this. There's a turbo version of this coming out in a few weeks. That's the turbocharged engine, and it has a T-tail rather than the lower tailplane on the thing. And if you've bought this thing, then you get 66% discount on the turbo version if you want to buy that. Now, if that means that if you bought both of them and you paid full price for this, you'd be ending up getting the other one for a tenner. So this would work out at 20 quid and the other one would work out at 20 quid. So, there's a bit to play around with. It's something to be aware of, however, that all those discounts and stuff like that, there, if you go to the Just Flight shop and buy it from there, a lot of that's not going to apply when this eventually goes onto the flight simulator in simulator store and what have you, where the Carenado one is and what have you. So I'd go to the Just Flight website if you're interested in looking at this thing. like the Carenado one, you get several paint jobs on it. Most of them have got a baked-in registration. The last one in the selection screen is the one that you can select where you can put registrations on there. So if that's catching you out, yes, you can put registrations on this thing, and you can see that I've got that on there. So let's go and take this for a bit of a fly and see what the differences are. So we're probably going to mow down Mr. Man there, and I'll get rid of the iPad with that little click spot there, and we will release the parking brake like that. Now you'll notice that when I do that and I set the parking brake and release the parking brake, the pedals aren't moving on this, whereas they are on the Carenado one. You'll notice too that this thing rolls before you've got any throttle on, which means that I might end up clanging it into that rock. So what I'm going to do is, just to make life a little bit easier, I'm going to push it back like that. Oh, and don't let that catch you out. If you've left the chocks on this thing and you try and push it back or taxi it or what have you, it ain't going to go. So there you go. So that's the built-in tow bar and not the sort of external view tow bar on there. Right, I'll get rid of that, like that, and we should be alright to go on the runway. Now this, I can use the flaps on, so we'll give it a little bit of flaps for takeoff. Now again, we'll keep an eye on the altimeter or altimeter if you're from these parts. This is a good airfield, this, by the way. La Chola, Tucson, Arizona. The reason it's pretty good is the runway is 19, which means that taking off from here, you're almost heading directly south. So it's good for flying circuits if you were looking for an airfield that's got almost on the cardinal points as far as headings are concerned and stuff like that, which is why I picked it for this this review. Now, just before we get rolling, I'm going to get on the brakes, I'm going to put the parking brake on, and I'll do the same thing that I did with the Carenado one. We'll get it. And you can see that's shaking around a lot. Now, I think that sound is a little bit closer. They're very similar on the Carenado one and this one, I think, but I think that one's a little bit closer to the noise that a three-bladed prop makes. You can feel free to disagree with me. Three-bladed props tend to be, a little bit less buzzsawy in the sound and what have you, which is why some people buy them. Although, as I say, they are more expensive. Anyway, let's go. Not something you have to worry about in a flight simulator. So I'm going to get this going. I'll go there. Let's give it some throttle. And you can see I am having to give this some rudder to keep it straight on the runway. Not much, but I am having to give it some. Now, that's another thing that you notice straight away with this. When you lift it off the deck, it comes off the deck more like a PA-28 than the Carenado one does. The PA-28 is, it's not a Spitfire. It can be a little bit, ponderous in the way, putting it in the gear, in the way the controls act. It was designed like that. It was designed to be, originally the PA-28 was designed to be a rival to the Cessna 172, because what Piper wanted was they wanted a training plane on the market, so that all the pilots who trained on a Piper plane would then have a bit of brand loyalty for Piper rather than Cessna. And what they did was they looked at the Cessna 172 and they analysed it, and they went, how can we make something that's like the Cessna 172 cheaper. So what they did was they looked at how the Cessna 172 had been constructed, and they kind of streamlined the idea of how it was produced, using less rivets, and they gave the PA-28 an all flying tailplane, so there was less moving parts, and they went for a low wing design so that the top of the wing uses basically the floor of the plane. So it was, and it works out about 8% cheaper than a Cessna 172 was to construct, and that's one of the reasons why the PA-28 was successful. Now, but it's not as successful as the Cessna 172. The Cessna 172 is the most successful airplane ever. There have been more Cessna 172s built than any other airplane. But I think the PA-28 is something like the third or fourth most successful airplane ever built. So it's no slouch. Now this thing, if I trim it, which I will do, is bouncing around a little bit more than the Carenado one does, and it's a little bit less inclined to fly completely hands off. Of course you can put it on the autopilot and stuff like that, and that's a little bit more like a PA-28. They're not all over the place when you fly them. They are sort of like fairly stable with being low wing, but the way they maneuver, I'm going to do that. You can see it's a little bit slow on the response in relation to the control movements, and that's probably a little bit more like a PA-28 is, and what have you. As I say, the Carenado one's not terrible and what have you, but if you want something that's more reminiscent of the real thing, then I think this one's slightly edging it when you actually get it in the air. So there we are, merrily flying along. I'll give you a good look. The that sort of light on the nose, yeah, it's definitely better looking on the Carenado one. So you can see now against the sky that kind of sort of dirt effect they've done on the windows, which isn't everyone's cup of tea, but as I say, you can change that in the config files. Some of those textures, like for example the seatbelt that's up there, not massively high resolution and what have you. So the Carenado's got a slightly shinier cockpit, if you will. But as I say, the sort of shabby look of this thing is an option. You can change it if you want to. You can have like you can change the avionics. You can give it a cleaner looking cockpit. So if you don't like that, where on the left hand side of the control yoke, the sort of paintwork and covering on the yokes come off, then you can change that if you want to. Now, no problem with this being able to lose speed, and like the Carenado one, this thing can do an okay side slip. But what I will show you is I'm not going to put the flaps down, but I will put the gear down, and I'll show you the difference, because you saw that I did that in the Carenado one. So we get the gear down, and you can see that I've got the throttle closed on this as well. I'll change the view a little bit so that you can definitely see that I've got the throttle closed, and you can see that this thing, if I try and maintain altitude with it, it's bleeding speed off significantly. And if I then start going cross control on it, I'm going to start losing a lot of altitude and losing speed and shaking around a little bit more and rattling and what have you. And there is, I suspect, no way that I would make the airfield if I kept the throttle off on this thing. Whereas you saw that with the Carenado one, it wasn't bleeding speed. You could see my airspeed indicator. I'm getting to the point where there's nothing on the clock but the maker's name if you do that. And if I stay like this with the throttle off, there is no way I would make that airfield. So I'm going to have to get some power on, otherwise I'm going to ditch this thing in. And we will get some flaps on as well. And you can see that I don't have any problem with the flaps deploying, and it's not nosing me into the ground. So you can see a difference on this thing. When you get the power off, this does lose airspeed and the Carenado one doesn't. And that's why this one's a little bit more realistic in many ways, and that's a demonstrable one, as you can see. See, no problem. No problem losing the speed on there. Now, granted, the can't see where I'm going, but granted that was with the flaps down. But you saw before I put the flaps down that that thing was losing speed when I got the throttle off. So, flight model wise, this thing is more like a real aeroplane than the Carenado one. Absolutely, no question about that. And this one does sort of fly pretty much like the real thing in, if not every respect, then most respects. So I think this is a case of you get what you pay for. But having said that, when the Carenado one gets patched, or Flight Simulator itself gets patched so that you can actually use the flaps on the thing, which I have got. Don't want to be taxiing with the flaps down. Now you'll notice a difference when I got the Carenado one to this position here. I'm just going to hold it on the brakes for a second and get the flaps up. When I got the Carenado one here, it wasn't moving, whereas this one, you do actually have to hold it on the brakes, as we saw, because they had to push it back. So which one do I prefer? Now, as I was saying, you know, when they the flaps are sorted out on that Carenado one, even though I think this Just Flight one is the better of the two, it's not like I wouldn't fly that Carenado one, because it's not terrible, and I like the cockpit on. I like the clean look of it, that thing, and I like the slightly messed up, more old school look of this as well. I like them both. So yeah, I wouldn't have bought. I always knew that I was going to buy this, but I wouldn't have bought the Carenado one, knowing that I was only going to fly it for a week and do a review on it and then never look at it again. So, you know, it's very easy to be critical of Carenado and go, oh yeah, you know, like they're not that great and they're just sort of cheap and cheerful planes and stuff like that. They're not really. There's a bit more to them than that, and I think the Carenado one is nice. I just think that this one is a little bit nicer, to the point that I would say that right now, with the state Microsoft Flight Simulator is in, I would say this Just Flight one is the best GA plane that you can get. It is that good. And if you had a previous version of one of the Just Flight Arrows, PA-28s, you qualify for a discount where it goes down to pretty much the same price as the Carenado one. And if you've bought stuff from Just Flight previously, you'll have some bonus points, some loyalty points that you can throw at it as well, which potentially could make it very much cheaper. So if I had to recommend one of them, if you didn't qualify for any of those discounts, I think it'd be hard to pick one. But if I absolutely had a gun to my head and someone told me you've got to recommend one, I'd say that this one, the Just Flight one, is the winner out of the two. I just think overall it's a nicer, more complex simulation of the real aeroplane. Keeping in mind, however, that there are some things about the Carenado one that are nicer. For example, the texturing here on the Carenado one in particular is nicer, and here where that lettering is, it's nicer on the Carenado one. There are minor details on the Carenado one that are a little bit more realistic. The most noticeable one of which is when you put the parking brake on or off, the pedals aren't moving at all, whereas they do on the Carenado one. Contrary to what a lot of people might think, when you do a comparison between a Carenado plane or an Alabao plane and something else, it's not necessarily the slaughter that people think it's going to be. You know what I mean? And that was not the intent of this comparison. It's just that they are both essentially the same plane, and what features of which one are going to make which one better suited to you. If you want to do sort of full-on autopilot landings in your GA aeroplane, Carenado one's probably going to be better for that. It's got more modern avionics, and some people just like to do that sort of thing. So there is that aspect to it. Anyway, to close out this video, enjoy a little bit of a Mickey take that I did about this being a showdown between the two planes, and look out for the next Chocks Hangar video. Anyway, check this out. You should give you a bit of a laugh.